Welcome. My name is Brittany Ward. I serve as the clinical supervisor for Dove Center. We're brought together today because October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Dove Center has invited various community partners to participate in a panel discussion about domestic violence awareness and prevention. I would like to invite each participant to briefly introduce themselves. We'll start with Choli.
Good afternoon, Chiliance with the St. George Police Department.
My name is Courtney Cannon, and I am the education coordinator for the Dove Center.
My name is Elizabeth Bloom. I'm the education program manager for Dove Center.
And I'm Christy Pike. I'm the director of the Washington County Children's Justice Center.
I'm Shirley Draper, and I'm the director of operations for Cherish Families.
I'm Susan Ann Stauffer, and I work as a clinical counselor for Dove.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. Let's just jump right into some questions. This is meant to be discussion-based. Obviously, there's a probing question, but jump in with any thoughts that you're having at any time. So I'm going to start with the myths, misconceptions about why victims stay. Does anybody have any comments about myths?
Sure, I'll start us off. One of the biggest myths out there is that domestic violence is about anger, poor anger management. And if that were the case, then the majority of situations, abusive people would not be able to control themselves in their work environments. Yet they often do. They often manage very well. They take direction well from their boss. They work with their coworkers. They have great relationships with their neighbors, their friends. Domestic violence is about a need to dominate, to exert power and control over the loved one. And sadly, too many people are experiencing that from their loved ones. The people who should be protecting and caring about them, who say they love them, and yet they're willing to hurt them, harm them, abuse them, take away their rights, isolate them, the many, many aspects of domestic violence. Another myth that comes to mind is that victims provoke or deserve violence. This is something the perpetrator of abuse will tell their victim, will tell their loved one, well, you know, if you would just get it right, if you would have my dinner ready on time when I walk in the door and everything in place, if you would just do this, then I wouldn't have to get so mad, that I wouldn't have to kick you, I wouldn't have to hit you, I wouldn't have to, you know, withdraw all the money with, you know, all the various forms of abuse. This is ridiculous. The only person accountable for this kind of behavior is the person doing the behavior. People don't provoke this. No one deserves this kind of abuse from the person that's supposed to be loving them, caring about them, cherishing them. Another myth that I would think of is that domestic violence is only about physical abuse, which is far from the truth. Emotional, psychological abuse can have far more lasting impacts, detrimental impacts on a person's life. The scars that are on the inside, those last forever. Physical violence is just one aspect of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, what we're going to be discussing. I'm going to let anybody else think of some other myths if you've got some off the top of your head.
Another myth, and I don't think we really bring this to consciousness very much, is the notion that domestic violence, interpartner violence, just usually happens to younger women. And it's often considered a younger person's problem, but and part of the reason for that is the majority of campaigns focus on younger people, and often the models that are used are younger people. But there's a whole bunch of evidence that violence against women doesn't stop as they grow older. We have to really scrutinize, I think, as a society, why we keep up this fiction as older unions as cozy and settled. It's a rather dangerous cliche.
I'll throw in another myth that I see quite often is we tend to think that domestic violence only happens to certain socioeconomic classes, i.e. low income. And quite honestly, it runs the gamut from, high income earners to low income earners. It doesn't have any sort of limits according to that.
I was just going to bring up that it's often assumed that domestic violence happens only to women. And while we do have statistics that show a higher disparity of women survivors, we also don't really know how accurate those statistics are, as it is less likely for men and LGBT plus folks, non-binary folks, to report any kind of violence, domestic violence, physical violence, emotional violence, otherwise. So a lot of people will pass it off as like, that's not really abuse, it isn't happening to you just because the person isn't a woman, and that's just not the case. There are a lot of other people that are being abused, and they even don't realize it because they're saying, well, I'm a 6 foot tall man, I can't possibly be abused, when really they are going through emotional abuse.
So another myth is that women could leave if they really wanted to, and that they go back because they love being abused. And I see this one actually more common, where the barriers to leaving and the reasons for not being able to leave really, really are complex, and many times involve children and financial reasons. And so when I hear people say, well, if she wanted to, she could leave him, then it really makes me want to disabuse these myths.
I think another myth that exists is when there are children in the home and they are not directly witnessing the violence, that they're not affected, that it's not an issue. Oh, my child wasn't in the room, she didn't really know what was going on, so she's fine. When really kids don't have to witness stuff to experience the emotions and the pain that comes along with violent relationships. They're very much aware that something's wrong. They don't need to understand the situation to respond emotionally and physically.
I love that, Brittany. And yeah, I totally agree. And statistics are showing that a disproportionate number of children who are exposed to domestic violence are actually under the age of 8. And that can really hinder their developmental progress going forward.
Absolutely. And it's for us at Dove Center, we have a interesting perspective because we're not just working with children, but we're working with many ages, many demographics. And we've been able to see the long-term effects of early childhood abuse and exposure to domestic violence in the women and the men that we work with that are experiencing intimate partner violence in their present relationship, but a whole toll of other complex traumas that they're carrying with them. And you can look at their history and see this original event that changed their brain. It changed the wiring in their brain and made them more susceptible to future abuse and future violence. It's tragic to see. If no one else has any other myths that they'd like to bring up, we can move on to another question. I believe our question about why do victims of domestic violence stay was brought up by Shirley. But I think it'd be good to expand on that even more and talk about some of the common reasons why people stay.
I think that you mentioned the kind of the brain wiring that happens. And I think that a lot of times women who were raised in households where there was domestic violence often find themselves in domestic violence situations and have normalized it to the point where they don't really realize that it's a problem and that they have other options. And so that's one of the things that I see, a little bit of a cultural identity around it. And then, of course, the financial barriers that I talked about, not wanting to, disrupt the home, disrupt the children, break up the family, and then all of the societal pressures around that as well. There are some really huge costs to much of the way we've set up our society. where it's so highly misogynistic and detrimental to women, where it comes to being socialized around what we can expect in terms of respect and nonviolence in the home.
I agree, Shirley. And when you're talking about financial barriers, we're not just talking about money, right? We're talking about insurance, we're talking about jobs, we're talking about housing. All of those things can be a huge barrier, I think, to women leaving. And as we talk about children, sometimes women may feel that their children are actually safer with them in the home than they would be in a shared custody arrangement.
You bring up a good point there, Christy. I've actually heard that time and time again, just even recently, that, you know, I can't leave because at least now I can monitor and supervise the interactions between my spouse and my child. But if I leave and he has unsupervised visitation or 50-50 custody, she's not going to be able to monitor it at all. Her child's at great risk, and that's terrifying. Women without children or men who are leaving a violent relationship without children are also terrified. It's not a simple, oh, just pack up your stuff and go. There's so many complex reasons that affect while they stay, and in that fear, the reality that their perpetrator could follow through on the abuse threats or the threats to kill them, that reality is pretty high for them. It's a very scary time.
And the same dynamic actually applies to animals and pets. I know that many women feel the same way, that they need to protect the animals and the pets, and that's another reason they're not able to go.
I would love for some of you to add some additional cultural perspectives as to why somebody might not leave, because I know that there's more. We can generalize some common reasons, but there are definitely more complex cultural reasons why someone wouldn't leave, or demographic reasons that I think is worth mentioning.
I was just about to jump in. So as far as the side of LGBT plus folks, there are some nuances that are added. So someone may be in a relationship and not out of the closet yet, and their partner is threatening to out them to their family, friends. Something else that is very common is that currently, while the community is growing, the queer community is still quite small. And so if you are with a partner and you all have the same friend groups, you go to the same places, your only support networks are visited by your perpetrator as well. If you leave them, if you make a big deal about this, you're going to lose your friends and all of your support networks, and not feel safe in any of the places that you previously felt were your sanctuaries. So these are just a few. There's also the emotional abuse of saying, like, no one else is going to believe you. No one else is going to think that your identity is real. I'm the only one that supports you and cares about you. Men can't abuse men, women can't abuse women, or we're in a dual abusive relationship. So if you leave, you're going to be in trouble too. And those types of things can happen in like heterosexual relationships as well. But I find that it's more common in LGBT plus relationships. Those are just some of the challenges that I've seen people in the community face.
And one of the things we know from working in this field too is we say, why do they stay? But what they're often doing is planning. And it takes so much effort to be able to leave safely and get their ducks in a row it's, so really it seems like they're staying longer than they should, but a lot of the time it's every day trying to figure out how is going to be the best and the safest way for me to do this.
Not to mention that leaving is the most dangerous time for a victim. They're the most risk for everything, including their life during that process.
I mean, I kind of mentioned it before, and I think that religion plays a huge part in cultural and societal expectations of women. I know it's true for much of our area, that our dominant religion, and even the religion I came from that's not dominant, have these expectations that women will be obedient and submissive. And that really contributes to family pressure and societal pressure to stay. I know that a woman that I'm very near and dear to was abused by her husband, and she was encouraged by her religious leaders to return to him and just be more obedient so that he wouldn't feel compelled to beat her. And I think that these are the kinds of conversations that we really need to start having as a society about those kinds of expectations.
I want to add to that. A lot of times when within religious aspects, there is abuse happening, the victim will go to a church leader and express that this abuse is happening, and the church leader will refer them to family therapy. However, as far as some religions that I'm aware of, they have specific church-related therapists within their own areas that are also holding the same beliefs and views about women's role in society as not only the perpetrator, but the church leader holds. And so now they're being placed in this environment where it's supposed to help them and guide them and help them to heal. And instead they're being told that they are the problem by a professional, which really, that would just make you feel mentally like maybe it is all in your head, that you really are the problem. That could be a really hard barrier to get over.
How about some other social barriers or societal barriers to leaving? There's so many, and I could get on a soapbox, but one really pretty big one that I can think of is the issues of a protective order or restraining order. There's very little that we can do to prevent an abuser from returning or repeating the abuse, despite having this legal piece of paper, this document here that says you're not allowed to be within so many feet of this victim. That's a societal issue. Why don't we talk about that more? I rarely hear anybody talking about that.
We should talk about it more. And divorces aren't necessarily easy to get or cheap either. So that's another barrier, right?
And that's on top of if their culture and religion frowns upon divorce or not.
So I'll say oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, culturally, you brought up what might be some cultural issues for the population that was FLDS, either former or current. There were a lot of barriers, and I'm speaking from experience here too, where I didn't own any assets, and I had no rental history, and I had no credit history, and I had no friends and family outside of our core group, which would always and only encourage me to return to my husband. And so just the kinds of things that a woman needs to survive in the world, some populations don't have access to those things. And I think that might be true for Native American women who live on the reservation, that transitioning into one of our, like the city of St. George or something like that might be just a huge high barrier.
I'll add something as far as what I've seen. Sometimes, kind of going through the legal system as far as getting a protective order and having it served and going through that process sometimes is quite daunting. And I know there's a lot of victims advocates helping survivors out there, but sometimes that process seems overwhelming. And if one little hiccups, that doesn't get served or whatever, they feel like, maybe the justice system isn't there for them, and that kind of dissuades them from wanting to pursue, getting out.
I want to bring up something as well that coworker Sandra brought up to me today, is that language is a huge barrier. And that's something that we see in our community a lot, is if there isn't a translator working, or if we aren't understanding what they're trying to say, or even just word and cultural differences can add this huge barrier of language, and also cause that isolation factor of only having this certain community that you can go to and feel safe around, and that would be taken away from you. And I think that here living, and I don't know if different elsewhere, but Utah not being as diverse of a state, or at least feels like it's not as diverse of a state, I feel like there's less options for different language translation services. And so clients might feel that they can't even reach out because they wouldn't be understood.